From the perspective of somatic cell, we know that dairy products and namely cheese and extended shelf life fluid can be severely impacted by high somatic cell count milk. And in cheese, it's both from the perspective of flavor and odor and body characteristics, and also from a yield perspective. So the processor who makes cheese out of high somatic cell count milk will get less cheese, essentially.
Welcome back to another episode of the Dairy Podcast Show. Today, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Nicole Martin to the show. Dr. Martin serves as an assistant research professor in dairy foods microbiology and the associate director of the Milk Quality Improvement Program at Cornell University. She received her BS, MS, and PhD degrees in food science from Cornell University, and she began her current role as an associate director in 2016. Nicole works closely with dairy industry stakeholders, including both producers and processors, on farm-to-table food microbiology. Her research interests take a holistic approach to dairy product quality and safety, with the mindset that providing consumers with high-quality dairy products must start at the farm and must be a priority throughout processing, distribution, and retail. So, Nicole, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks so much, Barry.
So, tell me a little bit how you got into this world. What got you started on microbiology, and what about your focus in dairy specifically?
So I grew up in the southern tier of upstate New York, so not far from where I am now in Ithaca, around a lot of dairy farms. So I actually had the chance to work on a neighbor's dairy farm during high school. So I got my introduction that way to the world of dairy. And then I came to Cornell actually as a food, nutrition, and agriculture major, and decided that I really wanted to focus on just that food piece. As I, sort of made my way through my freshman year, switched to food science, and had the idea that I would work in a processing facility, that I would do sort of QA, QC, in a dairy plant, and ice cream specifically, because who doesn't want to work in an ice cream processing facility, right? So I did an internship in that, and then I just happened to have had the opportunity. I met Dr. Catherine Bohr, who was the at the time the director of the Milk Quality Improvement Program, and who served 2 terms as dean of the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences here at Cornell. And she introduced me to food research and microbiology. And, that was sort of it for me. I was hooked, and I had the opportunity to start doing some research as an undergraduate, and did my master's and PhD after that, and took over the program, sort of provisionally at first when Catherine became the dean of the College of Ag and Life Sciences, and then sort of more officially more recently. And so, microbiology is just, I'm a complete nerd about it. I love to walk into the lab and see all of the, gross, cool things that we can culture out of milk and dairy products. So to me, there's nothing more fun than working with the bacteria and fungi. I do both in dairy.
That's fascinating. This is maybe a little bit off track, but I'm curious. It seems to me like sort of the average consumer in our lifetimes has shifted from bacteria or things that cause disease to, I think, a lot more people have a better understanding of how there's bacteria everywhere, and some of them are maybe pretty beneficial, as well as, some are problematic. How does that influence or affect, the work that you do as a microbiologist?
Yeah, so I would agree with you that I think there's a better understanding now than there has been in the past, but I think it is still, there's the conflation between food safety and food quality, which is one of the reasons that I think we have a food waste problem in our country. And, we label specifically dairy products, which are very perishable, like fluid milk, with a date, and then consumers still a lot of them are confused that at some point, if that date passes, then that product is no longer safe, which is certainly not true. And it doesn't even mean that it's not high quality anymore. It's it's a major contributor. And in fact, a colleague here at Cornell just did some consumer research, and we're still seeing very high percentages of consumers who have that image that there's a safety issue at some point in these products, and certainly, not accurate at all. So we have a lot of education to do on the consumer side still.
Yeah, absolutely. I fight that battle in my house. I'm the waste disposal. If somebody else won't drink things, I'll still eat. Probably a little extreme.
Good for you.
Yeah.
Battling food waste, one glass of milk at a time.
So I'd like to come at your work from the perspective of a dairy producer for a minute. So, there are some dairy producers out there who are super well educated on, what processors do, and others that know very little about it. But what everybody sees for sure in their milk checks is some little bonus or some aspect related to incentives to have low somatic cell counts and low plate counts, right? So speaking maybe specifically to people working on the farm side that maybe don't have a lot of perspective on why those are important and how sort of deviations in those numbers can impact product quality, fill us in on that if you would.
Sure. So yeah, there are a few big parameters at the production level that impact the finished product, and certainly somatic cell and total bacteria are two of those. From the perspective of somatic cell, we know that dairy products and namely cheese and extended shelf life fluid can be severely impacted by high somatic cell count milk. And in cheese, it's both from the perspective of flavor and odor and body characteristics, and also from a yield perspective. So the processor who makes cheese out of high somatic cell count milk will get less cheese, essentially. So those connections, those associations have been known for a really long time. I think in today's contemporary world, we know that producers are driving somatic cell counts down on average year over year, and doing a really good job at that. But we still see some of those high somatic cell count farms out there who still struggle with that. So fluid milk, especially extended shelf life, can also be impacted from a sort of flavor and odor perspective. Those are really driven by enzymes in the raw product from the high somatic cell counts or high somatic cell levels that degrade proteins over time. So that one has been really well studied. As far as the total count, this is a little more. It's a little trickier because typically we're not seeing super high total bacteria counts in the raw product. But if you start out with a high level and then there's any kind of abuse of that product, either at the farm level or during distribution or even at the processing facility, then we can start to reach levels of total bacteria that can impact the finished product, either because they survive pasteurization because they're in such high concentrations, or because they're heat resistant types to begin with that can survive in higher numbers anyway. We also see some enzyme production from high levels of psychotolerant bacteria like Pseudomonas. So that's sort of where the idea of the PI count comes in, because the preliminary incubation count sort of measures what level of bacteria that can grow at low temperatures over a period of time are there in that product. The nice thing about a total count is it's a direct measurement of the bacteria that are in that product at that time, whereas the PI count, for example, is a predictive test. It's saying if the conditions are right for these bacteria to grow during handling and distribution, could they do that? Right. So it doesn't mean that they will. So, within that category of bacteria, though, a lot of my research is on spore-forming bacteria. They're at very low levels in raw milk, and so they're typically not tested for routinely. There's some exceptions to that where processors are testing for spores, but they're one of the biggest impacts. They're the bacteria that make one of the biggest impacts on the finished product. But very difficult to actually accurately test for. So that makes it challenging. So you have to control for it in other ways.
Okay. So I want to dig into that, but to step back, you use the term psychrotolerant. Can you define that for us?
Sure, yes. So psychro meaning cold and tolerant meaning tolerant. And essentially these are bacteria that can grow at low temperatures. Some bacteria prefer to grow at low temperatures. We call those psychrophilic, so cold-loving. But there are a much broader group of bacteria that can grow at low temperatures and don't necessarily prefer those low temperatures.
Okay. So you started talking about spore formers, which I wanted to spend some time on. So first of all, what's the reason if they're found in low concentrations, if they're hard to detect? Why are they worth studying? What's the reason for trying to detect them?
Yeah. So this is a very special collection of bacteria, and it's not a huge group, but they're quite diverse. And these bacteria form endospores, and endospores are very resistant protein structures that essentially protect that organism from destruction that would otherwise happen during pasteurization or during sanitation or drying, those kind of things. So because they're super resistant to these sort of environmental pressures or processing pressures that we put on typical bacteria, they're particularly important. And then, sort of the pair to that is that not only can they survive, but then different groups can grow under various conditions that are found in dairy products. So, for example, we have the psychrotolerant spore-forming bacteria. These are organisms like Panibacillus and certain Bacillus species. They are very resistant. They survive pasteurization, but then they can grow at low temperatures. And so we know that about 50% of fluid milk in the U.S., high temperature short time milk, is spoiled by these spore-forming bacteria because they survived that initial heat treatment. And they are in low concentrations, but because of their growth patterns, they can grow to high enough concentrations to cause spoilage within the shelf life of a fluid milk product. In addition to those psychrotolerant bacteria, spore-forming bacteria, there are anaerobic bacteria that cause cheese spoilage. So these are actually in much lower concentrations. The psychrotolerant spore-forming bacteria are typically present in fluid milk at about 1 per 5 mils or 1 per 10 mils. And if you kind of contrast that to what we would typically see in a total bacteria count, it's extremely low. The anaerobic butyric acid producing bacteria, these are Clostridium species, and they're typically present at, as low as like 1 per 100 mils, even 1 per liter. And we know that even at these extremely low concentrations, they can cause spoilage in cheese products. And the spoilage that they cause is called late blowing. It essentially, these spores go through a process called germination, which is where they begin to grow. And in about 60 days of aging, they can turn, they produce copious amounts of gas and turn cheese into just a complete ball of cheese because it produces so much gas. So those ones are very difficult to control because, again, they're coming in at such low concentrations. It's very difficult to test for them. And and then you don't know, a processor doesn't know they have the spoilage until well into aging. And that aging process is very expensive. It's expensive to keep the facilities to do that. A lot of times it's, very manual from the perspective of having to flip cheeses, every day so that they age evenly across the entire cheese. So it's a big economic impact. And then sort of the last big group of spore-forming bacteria that we see in dairy are the thermophilic spore-forming bacteria. Those are ones that we find in dairy powders. And of course, dairy powders, big export opportunity for the U.S. dairy industry. And so spores are one of the big parameters that especially international customers test for in order to indicate if the powder was processed under hygienic conditions and has, overall high quality. And so the sort of desire, or the need for these low spore powders requires that even going back to the production level, that the entry of those organisms into the milk is controlled.
Okay. So it sounds to me like the majority of these, I guess, contamination issues, if you want to use that term, relate to product quality. Are any of these things of concern in terms of consumer health?
So there are spore-forming pathogens. So Bacillus cereus is one that a lot of people have heard of, or Clostridium botulinum is another that folks tend to know of. Bacillus cereus can cause two different types of human disease, and we know that these organisms are present in dairy products. It tends to be mild disease, so we don't have a good understanding of what the human health implications are at this point, because a lot of people don't report those types of illnesses. Maybe they have diarrhea for a day, or they, vomit a couple of times. Most people don't go to their doctor and get tested, right, for those kind of things. So it is a little more challenging from that perspective, but we know these organisms are in the raw milk. They show up in finished product. And one of the things our team is doing here is using some Monte Carlo simulations just to model out what are the risks of foodborne disease based on what we know about the types of pathogens that are spore forming in dairy, and how those products are handled throughout the distribution channel.
So you kind of talked about some interesting examples of how even very low abundance bacteria can, and I could imagine being very frustrated 60 days into putting a lot of resources and labor into a cheese product to have it go bad on you. Are there sort of global data, or at least national data, on like what fraction of total dairy products end up being wasted either at the production level, the retail level, the consumer level? Do we have those numbers?
Yeah, so they're getting a little dated at this point, but Gene Busby at the USDA did a really comprehensive survey about 10 years ago. And we know that dairy products, most of them are pretty perishable, right? So especially fluid milk. And so fluid milk really drives the waste of dairy products at the processing, retail, consumer level. And consumers are the biggest driver of that waste. So we don't see a lot of waste happening at retail. We don't see a lot of waste happening in, the processing facility. It's mostly coming from the consumers themselves. And, it's 25 billion pounds of dairy every year. So it's a lot of dairy. And 2/3 of that is fluid milk. And again, this goes back to sort of, a lot of miscommunication about if a product is still safe or good quality over time. And frankly, spoilage is a big factor in this waste, because once that product gets into a consumer's home, it only has a certain amount of time before it does have growth of different organisms, or even just abiotic issues like, it just doesn't taste great
Oxidation,
after
right? Yeah.
a period of time, right?
Yep.
So,
Yep.
yeah, there's light oxidation. There's, enzymes that are going to be active over that long of a period of time. So, but in order to address those things, it requires sort of this comprehensive approach, right? Like we have to address spoilage, we have to address consumer education, even things like cold chain issues are still there. Even now, we know that that's important, but e-commerce has really taken off since the pandemic started, and the temperatures that products are exposed to during that distribution is very uncontrolled. And if you think about, I don't know if you've used Instacart or one of those types of services, but these are folks who go into a store, they do shopping maybe for multiple customers at a time, so 2 or 3 customers at a time. So, they might have a half gallon or gallon of milk sitting in their cart while they're doing all this shopping, and then they go deliver it to people, right? And they could be on the road for an hour. So that product could be sitting in a hot car for a long time before you get it at your house. And so that's one thing that we're studying right now is sort of the implications of those, lack of cold chain during that distribution on the shelf life and quality of the product.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I remember that today in the U.S., only about 25% of milk actually ends up getting marketed as fluid milk, and yet it accounts for 2/3 of the waste. Is that right?
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And, there's new technologies, right? I mean, consumers want something more, not all consumers, and let me just revise that, because in the fluid milk category, consumers are still very price driven. So most consumers are still choosing the gallon, container of milk because it's the cheapest milk. And I think that, even with the sort of development and innovation that we see in fluid milk with more extended shelf life products, higher protein products, lower lactose products, which is, really exciting. And I think really answering a consumer need. There's still a lot of people out there who are buying just gallons of milk because that's what they can afford, right? So, but yes, consumers continue to drink less fluid, but overall consumption continues to rise, right? They're eating more cheese, they're eating more yogurt, they're eating ice cream, right? So, so I think overall not a bad picture for dairy, but certainly different than how we've seen it in the past.
So to circle back to the farm level, then I think that you've helped me learn a lot about some of the factors that drive stability of products and such. We've already talked about somatic cells and bacterial counts in raw milk. Are there things that you talk about within like the milk quality improvement program that you help lead that at the farm level are super impactful in terms of, putting a good product in front of consumers?
Yeah, so I think one thing that gets overlooked a lot are flavor and odor profiles of raw milk. We know that there's a lot of things that can impact the flavor and odor of raw milk that happen at the production level, and for the most part, there's the evaluation of whether there is a defect in that product is just like open the top of the tank and smell, right? So, but a lot of defects you can't smell, and we've been working a lot on this issue over the last couple of years. There are a lot of oxidized defects coming in raw milk products, and that's from a variety of different sources. But consumers are very sensitive to oxidized defects. So we've worked with a couple of fairly large manufacturers that were having consumer complaints right on their fresh milk. And we were able to track that back to oxidized defects in the raw product. And these are, you can address them. There are ways to manage that at the farm, but if you don't know that they're happening, that product goes out to the consumer and the consumer notices. And, I think just generally it's really important to, I think you mentioned something about producers in general have different feelings about, the finished product or have different levels of knowledge of the finished product. I think it's really important to keep in mind always that in the end, the consumer has a lot of options in today's marketplace, right? They have almond beverage and oats and whatever, there's a lot of options out there. And I don't think we need to put ourselves in a position where we give them any reason to switch to a different product when we have such a superior product, right? And certainly flavor and odor defects can impact their acceptance of our product. So we want to make sure we control that. Other things that, impact the flavor and odor. So we see oxidized flavors a lot. We can see things like microbially-induced flavors. So things like malty flavors that can originate from the growth of bacteria in the product before pasteurization. And then, to full disclosure, that can be at the farm or that can be in the processing facility prior to pasteurization. Bacteria grow, they don't stop growing once it leaves the farm. They just keep on growing. So that's one thing that I talk about a lot with industry is you have to control the farm level, you have to control that pre-processing in the facility, and then you have to control post-processing. So that's where that sort of comprehensive, systems approach comes from, because if you do one well, it's not going to matter. You're still not going to end up with a great product in the end.
As you're talking through this, I'm trying to think of scenarios that would lead to oxidized flavors that, at the farm level. Is it like a little bit of cleaning chemical contamination, or what is the most common?
Yeah, so there's actually a lot of different things that lead to oxidation, and oxidation tends to be sort of a dumping ground defect. So it could be anything from a water quality issue, like there are trace, metals in the water, old piping in the facility. It could be small leaks in pumps that introduce a little extra air, right? And that oxidizes. It could be, over agitation in the bulk tank. It could be long pipelines or high lifts in the pipeline. Even at the processing facility, milk is pretty susceptible to oxidation. So there's a lot of different factors that kind of lead into that. It can be a harder thing to troubleshoot. It can even go back to like feed. Having certain types of feed or not having enough antioxidants in the feed can lead to oxidation.
That's interesting.
And then certainly light, but we don't see that very often at the production level.
Right. Yeah, I suppose as we get to bigger milking centers on the larger farms, that those issues become greater risk. We have to think about it more. Yeah, fascinating. Thank you. Okay, we've got 3 questions we ask every guest. I'm going to throw these at you and we'll see what you have ready. So first of all, what is your favorite dairy-related book or resource?
So it's okay to go like full on nerd here, right? Like you're not going to judge me.
I'm not going to judge.
So on the dairy food side, we have standard methods for the examination of dairy products, and I refer to it with my team as the Bible, because we use it very frequently for our analyses. It covers a variety of different topics. So that's my sort of dairy go-to book on the food side, because it has all the methods.
That's good. Yeah, it's good for people to hear there are still printed resources that people use on a daily basis, because I agree.
That's right. Yeah. It hasn't gone completely away yet.
Okay, what about your favorite book or resource outside of ag?
Well, so I did put some thought into this, and I'm not sure if this is cheating or not, but the other book that I use a lot, it's actually a series of books, is the Berge's Manual for Systematic Bacteriology, because, ultimately I'm a microbiologist. Yep. And so we do a lot of method development in my group, and that requires having sort of that, detailed background on what sugars will an organism ferment, and what are the specific growth conditions and those kind of things. So I'd say between those two resources, that's what I use a lot, and of course I apply that Bergies to agriculture. So maybe that's a little bit cheating, but that's my answer.
I love the clear logic of those. Like, okay, it's like a lot of yes/no questions, right? Do they eat lactate or not? And it's, Last question. In your opinion, what sets successful dairy professionals apart from those who are less successful?
So I kind of have a philosophy, and I've talked about it a couple of times, but I think that what sets individuals who are successful apart, and what sets sort of our industry apart, and what we need to do is have sort of multidisciplinary collaboration. And I think that people who are willing to learn from other people who have expertise in different areas. I'm a food scientist, right? But I think that what happens at the production level is so important to the food product that we make, that and I've seen so much good come out of that, kind of getting outside of my little box of dairy foods, that that's something, I love to go on to farms and learn from farmers. I love to talk to people there. I love to go into the processing facility. I think we have to have that sort of just genuine connection with people, and and the willingness to sort of challenge ourselves to learn new things. I think that's what makes people successful. I think that's what will make our industry successful going forward, is being able to bridge those two areas.
Great answer. Well, thank you again, Dr. Nicole Martin, for joining us on the Dairy Podcast Show. Enjoyed the conversation about food microbiology and milk quality.
Thank you so much for having me.
Don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss the next episode, and we'll see you next time.